Part 2. New Patterns of Civilization, 500 to 1500 CE. 6. The Americas. 7. Ferment in the Middle East, the rise of Islam. 8. Early civilizations in Africa. 9. The expansion of civilization in South and Southeast Asia. 10. The flowering of traditional China. 11. The East Asian Rimlands, early Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. 12. The making of Europe. 13. The Byzantine Empire and crisis and recovery in the West. By the beginning of the first millennium CE, many of the great states of the ancient world were in decline, some were even at the point of collapse. On the ruins of these ancient empires, new patterns of civilization began to take shape between 400 and 1500 CE. In some cases, these new societies were built on the political and cultural foundations laid down by their predecessors. The Tang dynasty in China and the Guptas in India both looked back to the ancient period to provide an ideological model for their own time. The Byzantine Empire carried on parts of the classical Greek tradition while also adopting the powerful creed of Christianity from the Roman Empire. In other cases, new states incorporated some elements of the former classical civilizations while heading in markedly different directions, as was the case with the Arabic states in the Middle East and the new European civilization of the Middle Ages. In Europe, however, the Renaissance, which began in the 15th century, sought to bring about a revival of parts of the old Greco-Roman culture. During this period, a number of significant forces were at work in human society. The accoutrements of a more technologically advanced society gradually spread from the heartland regions of the Middle East, the Mediterranean basin, the South Asian subcontinent, and China into new areas of the world: sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Western Europe, Southeast Asia, and even the islands of Japan, off the eastern edge of the Eurasian landmass. Across the oceans, unique but advanced civilizations continued to take shape in isolation in the Americas. In the meantime, the vast migrations of peoples continued, leading not only to bitter conflicts but also to increased interchanges of technology and ideas. The result was the transformation of separate and distinct cultures and civilizations into an increasingly complex and vast world system embracing not only technology and trade but also ideas and religious beliefs. As had been the case during antiquity, the Middle East was at the heart of this activity. The Arab Empire, which took shape after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century, brought a measure of renewed stability to the region and provided the key link in the revived trade routes that threaded their way throughout Africa and much of the Eurasian supercontinent. The new religion of Islam became the cement that held the disparate peoples of the region together. Muslim traders, both Arab and Berber, opened contacts with West African societies south of the Sahara, while their ships followed the monsoon winds eastward as far as the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. Traders from Central Asia, some of them Muslim, carried goods back and forth along the Silk Road between the Middle East and China. For the next several hundred years, the great cities of the Middle East, Mecca, Damascus, and Baghdad, became among the wealthiest in the known world. Islam's contributions to the human experience during this period were cultural and technological as well as economic. Muslim philosophers preserved the works of the ancient Greeks for posterity. Muslim scientists and mathematicians made new discoveries about the nature of the universe and the human body, and Muslim cartographers and historians mapped the known world and speculated about the fundamental forces in human society. But the Middle East was not the only or necessarily even the primary contributor to world trade and civilization during this period. While the Arab Empire became the linchpin of trade between the Mediterranean and Eastern and Southern Asia, another center of primary importance in world trade was emerging in East Asia, focused on China. China had been a major participant in regional trade during the Han Dynasty, when its silks were already being transported to Rome via Central Asia, but its role had declined after the fall of the Han. Now, with the rise of the great Tang and Song dynasties, China re-emerged as a major commercial power in East Asia, trading by sea with Southeast Asia and Japan and by land with the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. Like the Middle East, China was also a prime source of new technology. From China came paper, printing, the compass, and gunpowder. The double-hulled Chinese junks that entered the Indian Ocean during the Ming dynasty were slow and cumbersome but extremely seaworthy and capable of carrying substantial quantities of goods over long distances. Many inventions arrived in Europe by way of India or the Middle East, and their Chinese origins were therefore unknown in the West. Increasing trade on a regional or global basis also led to the exchange of ideas. Buddhism was brought to China by merchants, and Islam first arrived in sub-Saharan Africa and the Indonesian archipelago in the same manner. Merchants were not the only means by which religious and cultural ideas spread, however. Sometimes migration, conquest, or relatively peaceful processes played a part. The case of the Bantu-speaking peoples in Central Africa is apparently an example of peaceful expansion, and while Islam sometimes followed the path of Arab warriors, they seldom imposed their religion by force on the local population. In some instances, as with the Mongols, the conquerors made no effort to convert others to their own religions. By contrast, Christian monks, motivated by missionary fervor, converted many of the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. Roman Catholic monks brought Latin Christianity to the Germanic and Western Slavic peoples, and monks from the Byzantine Empire largely converted the Southern and Eastern Slavic populations to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Another characteristic of the period between 500 and 1500 CE was the almost constant migration of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples. Dynamic forces in the Gobi Desert, Central Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and Central Africa provoked vast numbers of peoples to abandon their homelands and seek their livelihood elsewhere. Sometimes the migration was peaceful. More often, however, migration produced political instability and sometimes invasion and subjugation. As had been the case during antiquity, the most active source of migrants was Central Asia. The region later gave birth to the fearsome Mongols, whose armies advanced to the gates of Central Europe and conquered China in the 13th century. Wherever they went, they left a trail of enormous destruction and loss of life. Inadvertently, the Mongols were also the source of a new wave of epidemics that swept through much of Europe and the Middle East in the 14th century. The spread of the plague known at the time as the Black Death took much of the population of Europe to an early grave. But there was another side to the era of nomadic expansion. Even the invasions of the Mongols, the scourge of God, as Europeans of the 13th and 14th centuries called them, had constructive as well as destructive consequences. After their initial conquests, for a brief period of 3 generations, the Mongols provided an avenue for trade throughout the most extensive empire, known as the Pax Mongolica, the world had yet seen. Chapter 6. The Americas. Chapter Outline and Focus Questions. The peopling of the Americas. Who were the first Americans, and when and how did they come? Early civilizations in Central America. What were the main characteristics of religious belief in early Mesoamerica? The first civilizations in South America. What role did the environment play in the evolution of societies in the Americas? Stateless societies in the Americas. What were the main characteristics of stateless societies in the Americas, and how did they resemble and differ from the civilizations that rose there? Critical thinking. In what ways were the early civilizations in the Americas similar to the civilizations discussed in Part 1? And in what ways were they unique? Connections to today. Do the environmental problems encountered by pre-Columbian societies in the Americas have relevance today? Why or why not? In the summer of 2001, a powerful hurricane swept through Central America, destroying houses and flooding villages all along the Caribbean coast of Belize and Guatemala. Farther inland, at the archaeological site of Dos Pilas, it uncovered new evidence concerning a series of dramatic events that had taken place nearly 1,500 years earlier. Beneath a tree uprooted by the storm, archaeologists discovered a block of stones containing hieroglyphics that described a brutal war between two powerful city-states of the area, a conflict that ultimately contributed to the decline and fall of Mayan civilization, perhaps the most advanced society then in existence throughout Central America. Mayan civilization, the origins of which can be traced back to about 500 BCE, was not as old as some of its counterparts that we have discussed in part 1 of this book. But it was the most recent version of a whole series of human societies that had emerged throughout the Western Hemisphere as early as the 3rd millennium BCE. Although these early societies are not yet as well known as those of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India, evidence is accumulating that advanced civilizations had existed in the Americas thousands of years before the arrival of Hernando Cortés and the Spanish conquistadors in 1519. The peopling of the Americas. Focus question: who were the first Americans, and when and how did they come? The Maya were only the latest in a series of sophisticated societies that had sprung up at various locations in North and South America since human beings first crossed the Bering Strait several millennia earlier. Most of these early peoples, today often referred to as Amerindians, lived by hunting and fishing or by food gathering. But eventually organized societies, based on the cultivation of agriculture, began to take root in Central and South America. One key area of development was on the plateau of central Mexico. Another was in the lowland regions along the Gulf of Mexico and extending into modern Guatemala. A third was in the central Andes Mountains, adjacent to the Pacific coast of South America. Others were just beginning to emerge in the vast Amazon River basin and in the river valleys and Great Plains of North America. For 2,000 years, these societies developed in isolation from their counterparts elsewhere in the world. This lack of contact with other human populations deprived them of access to technological and cultural developments taking place in Africa, Asia, and Europe. They did not know of the wheel, for example, and their written languages were rudimentary compared to those in complex civilizations elsewhere around the globe. They did not benefit from the presence of the horse, which had died out in the Americas thousands of years previously, and of other draft animals such as the ox and the water buffalo. Still, in many respects, their cultural achievements were the equal of those realized elsewhere. When the first European explorers arrived in the region at the turn of the 16th century, they described much that they observed in glowing terms. The first Americans. When the first human beings arrived in the Western Hemisphere has long been a matter of conjecture. In the centuries following the voyages of Christopher Columbus, 1492 to 1504, speculation centered on the possibility that the first settlers to reach the American continents had crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Were they the lost tribes of Israel? Were they Phoenician seafarers from Carthage? Were they refugees from the legendary lost continent of Atlantis? In all cases, the assumption was that they were relatively recent rivals. By the mid-19th century, under the influence of the Darwinian concept of evolution, a new theory developed. It proposed that the peopling of America had taken place much earlier as a result of the migration of small groups across the Bering Strait, at a time when the area was a land bridge uniting the continents of Asia and North America. Recent evidence, including numerous physical similarities between most early Americans and contemporary peoples living in northeastern Asia, has confirmed this hypothesis. The debate on when the migrations began continues, however. The archaeologist Louis Leakey, one of the pioneers in the search for the origins of humankind in Africa, suggested that the first hominids may have arrived in America as long as 1 lakh years ago. Most scholars today, However, estimate that the first Americans were Homo sapiens sapiens who crossed from Asia by foot between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago in pursuit of herds of bison and caribou that moved into the area in search of grazing land at the end of the last ice age. Some suggest that early migrants from Asia may have followed a maritime route down the western coast of the Americas, supporting themselves by fishing and feeding on other organisms floating in the sea. In recent years, a number of fascinating new possibilities have opened up. A number of sites discovered at such disparate locations as Cactus Hill in Virginia, Buttermilk Creek in Texas, and Paisley Cave in Oregon show signs of human habitation as long as 15,000 years ago. Other recent discoveries raise the possibility that some early settlers may have originally come from Africa or from the South Pacific rather than from Asia. The question has not yet been answered definitively. Nevertheless, it is now generally accepted that human beings were living in the Americas at least 15,000 years ago. They gradually spread throughout the North American continent and had penetrated almost to the southern tip of South America by about 11,000 BCE. These first Americans were hunters and food gatherers who lived in small nomadic communities close to the sources of their food supply. Although it is not known when agriculture was first practiced, beans and squash seeds have been found at sites that date back at least 10,000 years, implying that farming arose in America almost as early as in the Middle East. The cultivation of maize, corn, and perhaps other crops as well, appears to have been underway as early as 5000 BCE in the Tehuacan Valley in central Mexico. Archaeologists have traced the ancestry of corn back at least 9,000 years to a wild Mexican grass called tusanti. Through a lengthy process of experimentation, local farmers transformed it into a highly productive food crop that enabled the rise of the first civilizations in the Americas. A similar process may have occurred in the lowland regions near the modern city of Veracruz and in the Yucatan Peninsula farther to the east. There, in the region that archaeologists call Mesoamerica, one of the first civilizations in the Americas began to appear. Early civilizations in Central America. Focus question: what were the main characteristics of religious belief in early Mesoamerica? The first signs of civilization in Mesoamerica appeared at the end of the second millennium BCE, with the emergence of what is called Olmec culture in the hot and swampy lowlands along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico south of Veracruz. The Olmecs, in the land of rubber. Olmec civilization was characterized by intensive agriculture along the muddy riverbanks in the area and by the carving of stone ornaments, tools, and monuments at sites such as San Lorenzo and La Venta. The site at La Venta contains a ceremonial precinct with a 30-foot-high earthen pyramid, the largest of its state in all Mesoamerica. The Olmec peoples organized a widespread trading network, carried on religious rituals, and devised an as-yet undeciphered system of hieroglyphics that is similar in some respects to later Mayan writing. See Mayan hieroglyphs and calendars later in this chapter, and may be the ancestor of the first true writing systems in the Americas. Olmec society apparently consisted of several classes, including a class of skilled artisans who produced a series of massive stone heads, some of which are more than 10 feet high. The Olmec peoples supported themselves primarily by cultivating crops, such as corn and beans, but also engaged in fishing and hunting. The Olmecs apparently played a ceremonial game on a stone ball court, a ritual that would later be widely practiced throughout the region. See the Maya later in this chapter. The ball was made from the sap of a local rubber tree, thus providing the name Olmec, people of the land of rubber. Trade between the Olmecs and their neighbors was apparently quite extensive, and rubber was one of the products most desired by peoples in nearby regions. It was used not only for the manufacture of balls, but also for rubber bands and footwear, as the Olmec learned how to mix the raw latex, the sap of the rubber tree, with other ingredients to make it more supple. Eventually, Olmec civilization began to decline, and it apparently collapsed around the 4th century BCE. During its heyday, however, it extended from Mexico City to El Salvador and perhaps to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. The Zapotecs. Parallel developments were occurring at Monte Alban, on a hillside overlooking the modern city of Oaxaca, in central Mexico. Around the middle of the first millennium BCE, the Zapotec peoples created an extensive civilization that flourished for several hundred years in the highlands. Like the Olmec sites, Monte Alban contains a number of temples and pyramids, but they are located in much more awesome surroundings on a massive stone terrace atop a 1,200-foot high mountain overlooking the Oaxaca Valley. The majority of the population, estimated at about 20,000, dwelled on terraces cut into the sides of the mountain known to local residents as Danaban, or Sacred Mountain. The government at Monte Alban was apparently theocratic, with an elite class of nobles and priests ruling over a population composed primarily of farmers and artisans. Like the Olmecs, the Zapotecs devised a written language that has not been deciphered. Zapotec society survived for several centuries following the collapse of the Olmecs, but Monte Alban was abandoned for unknown reasons in the late 8th century CE. Teotihuacan, America's first metropolis. The first major metropolis in Mesoamerica was the city of Teotihuacan, capital of an early state about 30 miles northeast of Mexico City that arose around the 3rd century BCE and flourished for nearly a millennium until it collapsed under mysterious circumstances about 800 CE. Along the main thoroughfare were temples and palaces, all dominated by the massive Pyramid of the Sun, under which archaeologists have discovered the remains of sacrificial victims, probably put to death during the dedication of the structure. In the vicinity are the remains of a large market where goods from distant regions as well as agricultural produce grown by farmers in the vicinity were exchanged. The products traded included cacao, rubber, feathers, and various types of vegetables and meat. Pulque, a liquor extracted from the agave plant, was used in religious ceremonies. An obsidian mine nearby may explain the location of the city. Obsidian is a volcanic glass that was prized in Mesoamerica for use in tools, mirrors, and the blades of sacrificial knives. Most of the city consisted of one-story stucco apartment compounds. Some were as large as 35,000 square feet, sufficient to house more than 100 people. Each apartment was divided into several rooms, and the compounds were covered by flat roofs made of wooden beams, poles, and stucco. The compounds were separated by wide streets laid out on a rectangular grid and were entered through narrow alleys. Living in the fertile Valley of Mexico, an upland plateau surrounded by magnificent snow-capped mountains, the inhabitants of Teotihuacan probably obtained the bulk of their wealth from agriculture. At that time, the valley floor was filled with swampy lakes containing the water runoff from the surrounding mountains. The combination of fertile soil and adequate water made the valley one of the richest farming areas in Mesoamerica. Sometime during the 8th century CE, perhaps because of drought or the overcultivation of the land, the wealth and power of the city began to decline, and eventually its ruling class departed, with the priests carrying stone images of local deities on their backs. The next 2 centuries were a time of troubles throughout the region as principalities fought over limited farmland. The problem was later compounded when peoples from surrounding areas, attracted by the rich farmlands, migrated into the Valley of Mexico and began to compete for territory with small city-states already established there. As the local population expanded, farmers began to engage in more intensive agriculture. They drained the lakes to build chinampas, swampy islands crisscrossed by canals that provided water for their crops and easy transportation to local markets for their excess produce. The Olmecs, mother culture or first among equals. What were the relations among these early societies in Mesoamerica? Trade contacts were quite active, as the Olmecs exported rubber to their neighbors in exchange for salt and obsidian. During its heyday, Olmec influence extended throughout the region, leading some historians to surmise that it was a mother culture, much as the Shang dynasty was once thought to be in ancient China. A 7th century BCE pyramid recently unearthed in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas contained tomb objects that bore some resemblance to counterparts in the Olmec site of La Venta, but also displayed characteristics unique to the Zoque culture that was prevalent in that region at the time. Some scholars point to such indigenous elements to suggest that perhaps the Olmec were merely first among equals. This issue has not yet been resolved. The Maya. Far to the east of the Valley of Mexico, another major civilization had arisen in what is now the state of Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula. This was the civilization of the Maya, those who grow maize in the Mayan language, which was older and just as sophisticated as the society at Teotihuacan. Origins. It is not known when human beings first inhabited the Yucatan Peninsula, but peoples contemporaneous with the Olmecs were already cultivating such crops as corn, yams, and manioc in the area during the first millennium BCE. As the population increased, an early civilization began to emerge along the Pacific coast directly to the south of the peninsula and in the highlands of modern Guatemala. Contacts were already established with the Olmecs to the west. Since the area was a source for cacao trees and obsidian, the inhabitants soon developed relations with other early civilizations in the region. Cacao trees, whose name derives from the Mayan word cacao, were the source of chocolate, which was drunk as a beverage by the upper classes, while cocoa beans, the fruit of the cacao tree, were used as currency in markets throughout the region. A fermented beer was produced from the pulp of the fruit. The chocolate consumed in ancient Mesoamerican cultures was roasted and had a bitter taste. The flavor survives today in a classic sauce mold that includes unsweetened chocolate and chili peppers among its ingredients and is served with poultry and other meats. Chocolate did not develop its familiar sweet taste until the 17th century when cocoa beans were brought to Europe and sugar and milk were added. As the population in the area increased, the inhabitants began to migrate into the central Yucatan Peninsula and farther to the north. The overcrowding forced farmers in the lowland areas to shift from slash-and-burn cultivation to swamp agriculture of the type practiced in the lake region of the Valley of Mexico. By the middle of the first millennium CE, the entire area was honeycombed with a patchwork of small city-states competing for land and resources. The largest urban centers such as Tikal may have had 100,000 inhabitants at their height and displayed a level of technological and cultural achievement that was unsurpassed in the region. By the end of the 3rd century CE, Mayan civilization had begun to enter its classical phase. Political structures. The power of Mayan rulers was impressive. One of the monarchs at Copan, known to scholars as 18 Rabbit from the hieroglyphs composing his name, ordered the construction of a grand palace requiring more than 30,000 person-days of labor. Around the ruler was a class of aristocrats whose wealth was probably based on the ownership of land farmed by their poorer relatives. Eventually, many of the nobles became priests or scribes at the royal court or adopted honored professions as sculptors or painters. As the society's wealth grew, so did the role of artisans and traders, who began to form a small middle class. The majority of the population on the peninsula, however, estimated at roughly 3 million at the height of Mayan prosperity, were farmers. They lived on their chinampa plots or on terraced hills in the highlands. Houses were built of adobe and thatch and probably resembled the houses of the majority of the population in the area today. There was a fairly clear-cut division of labor along gender lines. The men were responsible for fighting and hunting, the women for homemaking and the preparation of cornmeal, the staple food of much of the population. Some noblewomen, however, seem to have played important roles in both political and religious life. In the 7th century CE, for example, Pakal became king of Palenque, one of the most powerful of the Mayan city-states, through the royal line of his mother and grandmother, thereby breaking the patrilineal descent twice. His mother ruled Palenque for 3 years and was the power behind the throne for her son's first 25 years of rule. Pickle legitimized his kingship by transforming his mother into a divine representation of the first mother goddess. Mayan religion. Like some of the early religious beliefs in Asia and the Mediterranean, Mayan religion was polytheistic. Although the names were different, Mayan gods shared many of the characteristics of deities of nearby cultures. The supreme god was named Itzama, Lizard House. Viewed as the creator of all things, he was credited with bringing the knowledge of maize, cacao, medicine, and writing to the Mayan people. Characteristics, as in ancient Greece and India. Some, like the jaguar god of night, were evil rather than good. Many of the nature deities may have been viewed as manifestations of one supreme godhead. As at Teotihuacan, human sacrifice, normally by decapitation, was practiced to propitiate the heavenly forces. Mayan cities were built around a ceremonial core dominated by a central pyramid surmounted by a shrine to the gods. Nearby were other temples, palaces, and a sacred ball court. Like many of their modern counterparts, Mayan cities suffered from urban sprawl, with separate suburbs for the poor and the middle class, and even strip malls stretched along transportation routes, where merchants hawked their wares to pedestrians passing by. The ball court was a rectangular space surrounded by vertical walls with metal rings through which the contestants attempted to drive a hard rubber ball. Although the rules of the game are only imperfectly understood, it apparently had religious significance, and the vanquished players were sacrificed in ceremonies held after the close of the game. Most of the players were men, although there may have been some women's teams. Similar courts have been found at sites throughout Central and South America, with the earliest, located near Veracruz, dating back to around 1500 BCE. Mayan hieroglyphs and calendars. The Mayan writing system, developed during the mid-1st millennium BCE, was based on hieroglyphs that remained undeciphered until scholars recognized that symbols appearing in many passages represented dates in the Mayan calendar. This elaborate calendar, which measures time back to a particular date in August 3114 BCE, required a sophisticated understanding of astronomical events and mathematics to compile. Starting with these known symbols as a foundation, modern scholars have gradually deciphered the script. Like the scripts of the Sumerians and ancient Egyptians, the Mayan hieroglyphs were both ideographic and phonetic and were becoming more phonetic as time passed. The responsibility for compiling official records in the Mayan city-states was given to a class of scribes, who wrote on deerskin or strips of tree bark. Unfortunately, virtually all such records have fallen victim to the ravages of a humid climate or were deliberately destroyed by Spanish missionaries after their arrival in the 16th century. As one Spanish bishop remarked at the time, "We found a large number of books in these characters and, as they contain nothing in which there were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction." As a result, almost the only surviving written records dating from the classical Mayan era are those that were carved in stone. One of the most important repositories of Mayan hieroglyphs is at Palenque, an archaeological site deep in the jungles in the neck of the Mexican peninsula, considerably to the west of the Yucatan. In a chamber located under the Temple of Inscriptions, archaeologists discovered a royal tomb and a massive limestone slab covered with hieroglyphs. By deciphering the message on the slab, archaeologists for the first time identified a historical figure in Mayan history. He was the ruler named Pickle, known from his glyph as the shield. Pickle ordered the construction of the Temple of Inscriptions in the mid-7th century, and it was his body that was buried in the tomb at the foot of the staircase leading down into the crypt. As befits their intense interest in the passage of time, the Maya also had a sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and kept voluminous records of the movements of the heavenly bodies. According to some knowledgeable observers, Mayan pyramids, known as Huaca, was situated to observe the stars. There were practical reasons for their concern. The arrival of the planet Venus in the evening sky, for example, was a traditional time to prepare for war. The Maya also devised the so-called long count, a system of calculating time based on a lunar calendar that called for the end of the current cycle of 5,200 years in the year 2012 of the Western solar-based Gregorian calendar. Scholars once believed that the Maya were a peaceful people who rarely engaged in violence. Now, however, it is thought that rivalry among Mayan city-states was endemic and often involved bloody clashes. Scenes from paintings and rock carvings depict a society preoccupied with war and the seizure of captives for sacrifice. The conflict mentioned at the beginning of this chapter is but a recent example. During the 7th century CE, two powerful city-states, Tikal and Kalakmul, competed for dominance throughout the region, setting up puppet regimes and waging bloody wars that wavered back and forth for years but ultimately resulted in the total destruction of Kalakmul at the end of the century. The mystery of Mayan decline. Sometime in the 8th or 9th century, the classical Mayan civilization in the central Yucatan Peninsula began to decline. At Copan, for example, it ended abruptly in 822 CE, when work on various stone sculptures ordered by the ruler suddenly ceased. The end of Palenque soon followed, and the city of Tikal was abandoned by 870 CE. Whether the decline was caused by overuse of the land, incessant warfare, internal revolt, or a natural disaster such as a volcanic eruption is a question that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. Recent evidence supports the theory that overcultivation of the land due to a growing population gradually reduced crop yields. A long drought, which lasted throughout most of the 9th and 10th centuries CE, may have played a major role, although the city-state of Tikal, blessed with fertile soil and the presence of nearby Lake Peyton, does not appear to have suffered from a lack of water. In general, though, as arable land and water became increasingly scarce, conflict among the various mini-states in the region may have intensified, accelerating the process leading to a final collapse. Whatever the case, cities such as Tikal and Palenque were abandoned to the jungles. In their place, newer urban centers in the northern part of the peninsula, such as Uxmal and Chichen Itza, continued to prosper, although the level of cultural achievement in this post-classical era did not match that of previous years. According to local history, this latter area was taken over by peoples known as the Toltecs, led by a man known as Cuculcan, who migrated to the peninsula from Teotihuacan in central Mexico sometime in the 10th century. Some scholars believe this flight was associated with the legend of the departure from that city of Quetzalcoatl, a deity in the form of a feathered serpent who promised that he would someday return to reclaim his homeland. The Toltecs apparently controlled the Upper Peninsula from their capital at Chichen Itza for several centuries, but this area was less fertile and more susceptible to drought than the earlier regions of Mayan settlement, and eventually they too declined. By the early 16th century, the area was divided into a number of small principalities, and the cities, including Uxmal and Chichen Itza, had been abandoned. The Aztecs. Among the groups moving into the Valley of Mexico after the fall of Teotihuacan were the Mexica. No one knows their origins, although folk legend held that their original homeland was an island in a lake called Aztlan. From that legendary homeland comes the name Aztec, by which they are known to the modern world. Sometime during the early 12th century, the Aztecs left their original habitat and, carrying an image of their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, began a lengthy migration that climaxed with their arrival in the Valley of Mexico sometime late in the century. Less sophisticated than many of their neighbors, the Aztecs were at first forced to seek alliances with stronger city-states. They were excellent warriors, however, and, like Sparta in ancient Greece and the state of Qin in Zhou dynasty China, theirs had become the dominant city-state in the lake region by the early 15th century. Establishing their capital at Tenochtitlan, On an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, they set out to bring the entire region under their domination. For the remainder of the 15th century, the Aztecs consolidated their control over much of what is modern Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and as far south as the Guatemalan border. The new kingdom was not a centralized state but a collection of semi-autonomous territories. To provide a unifying focus for the kingdom, the Aztecs promoted their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, as the guiding deity of the entire population, which now numbered several million. Politics. Like all great empires in ancient times, the Aztec state was authoritarian. Power was vested in the monarch, whose authority had both a divine and a secular character. The Aztec ruler claimed descent from the gods and served as an intermediary between the material and the metaphysical worlds. Unlike many of his counterparts in other ancient civilizations, however, the monarch did not obtain his position by a rigid law of succession. On the death of the ruler, his successor was selected from within the royal family by a small group of senior officials, who were also members of the family and were therefore eligible for the position. Once placed on the throne, the Aztec ruler was advised by a small council of lords, headed by a prime minister who served as the chief executive of the government, and a bureaucracy. Beyond the capital, the power of the central government was limited. Rulers of territories subject to the Aztecs were allowed considerable autonomy in return for paying tribute, in the form of goods or captives, to the central government. The most important government officials in the provinces were the tax collectors, who collected the tribute. They used the threat of military action against those who failed to carry out their tribute obligations and therefore, understandably, were not popular with the taxpayers. According to Bernaldez, a Spaniard who recorded his impressions of Aztec society during a visit in the early 16th century, all these towns complained about Moctezuma, the Aztec ruler, and his tax collectors, speaking in private so that the Mexican ambassadors should not hear them. However, they said these officials robbed them of all they possessed, and that if their wives and daughters were pretty they would violate them in front of their fathers and husbands and carry them away. They also said that the Mexicans, that is, the representatives from the capital, made the men work like slaves, compelling them to carry pine trunks and stone and firewood and maize overland and in canoes, and to perform other tasks, such as planting maize fields, and that they took away the people's lands as well for the service of their idols. Social structures. Positions in the government bureaucracy were the exclusive privilege of the hereditary nobility, all of whom traced their lineage to the founding family of the Aztec clan. Male children in noble families were sent to temple schools, where they were exposed to a harsh regimen of manual labor, military training, and memorization of information about Aztec society and religion. On reaching adulthood, they would select a career in the military service, the government bureaucracy, or the priesthood. As a reward for their services, senior officials received large estates from the government, and they alone had the right to hire communal labor. The remainder of the population consisted of commoners, indentured workers, and slaves. Most indentured workers were landless laborers who contracted to work on the nobles' estates, while slaves served in the households of the wealthy. Slavery was not an inherited status, and the children of slaves were considered free citizens. Commoners might sell themselves into slavery when in debt and then later purchase their freedom. The vast majority of the population consisted of commoners. All commoners were members of large kinship groups called kalpalis. Each kalpali, often consisting of as many as 1,000 members, was headed by an elected chief, who ran its day-to-day affairs and served as an intermediary with the central government. Each kalpali was responsible for providing taxes, usually in the form of goods, and conscript labor to the state. Each kalpali maintained its own temples and schools and administered the land held by the community. Farmland within the kalpali was held in common and could not be sold, although it could be passed down within the family. In the cities, each Kalpali occupied a separate neighborhood, where its members often performed a particular function, such as metal working, stone cutting, weaving, carpentry, or commerce. Apparently, a large proportion of the population engaged in some form of trade, at least in the densely populated Valley of Mexico, where an estimated half of the people lived in an urban environment. Many farmers, who cultivated their crops in Chinampas as their predecessors had for centuries, brought their goods to the markets via the canals and sold them directly to retailers. The Kalpali compounds themselves were divided into smaller family units. Individual families lived in small flat-roofed dwellings containing 1 or 2 rooms. Each house was separate from its neighbors and had direct access to the surrounding streets and canals. The houses of farmers living on the Chinampas were set on raised dirt platforms built above the surrounding fields to prevent flooding. Gender roles within the family were rigidly stratified. Male children were trained for war and were expected to serve in the army on reaching adulthood. Women were expected to work in the home, weave textiles, and raise children, although, like their brothers, they were permitted to enter the priesthood. According to Bernaldez, a female deity presided over the rites of marriage. As in most traditional societies, chastity and obedience were desirable female characteristics. Although women in Aztec society enjoyed more legal rights than women in some other traditional civilizations, they were still not equal to men. Women were permitted to own and inherit property and to enter into contracts. Marriage was usually monogamous, although noble families sometimes practiced polygyny, having more than one wife at a time. Wedding partners were normally selected from within the lineage group but not the immediate family. As in most societies at the time, parents usually selected their child's spouse, often for purposes of political or social advancement. Classes in Aztec society were rigidly stratified. Commoners were not permitted to enter the nobility, although some occasionally rose to senior positions in the army or the priesthood as the result of exemplary service. As in medieval Europe, such occupations often provided a route of upward mobility for ambitious commoners. A woman of noble standing would sometimes marry a commoner because the children of such a union would inherit her higher status, and she could expect to be treated better by her husband's family, who would be proud of the marriage relationship. Land of the Feathered Serpent, Aztec religion and culture. The Aztecs, like their contemporaries throughout Mesoamerica, lived in an environment populated by a multitude of gods. Scholars have identified more than 100 deities in the Aztec pantheon. Some of them were nature spirits, like the rain god, Tlaloc, and some were patron deities, like the symbol of the Aztecs themselves, Huitzilopochtli. A supreme deity, called Ometeotl, represented the all-powerful and omnipresent forces of the heavens, but he was rather remote, and other gods, notably the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl, had a more direct impact on the lives of the people. Representing the forces of creation, virtue, and learning and culture, Quetzalcoatl bears a distinct similarity to Shiva in Hindu belief. According to Aztec tradition, this godlike being had left his homeland in the Valley of Mexico in the 10th century, promising to return in triumph. Aztec cosmology was based on a belief in the existence of two worlds, the material and the divine. The earth was the material world and took the form of a flat disk surrounded by water on all sides. The divine world, which consisted of both heaven and hell, was the abode of the gods. Human beings could aspire to a form of heavenly salvation but first had to pass through a transitional stage, somewhat like Christian purgatory, before reaching their final destination, where the soul was finally freed from the body. To prepare for the final day of judgment, as well as to help them engage in proper behavior through life, all citizens underwent religious training at temple schools during adolescence and took part in various rituals throughout their lives. The most devout were encouraged to study for the priesthood. Once accepted, they served at temples ranging from local branches at the Kalpali level to the highest shrines in the ceremonial precinct at Tenochtitlan. In some respects, however, Aztec society may have been undergoing a process of secularization. By late Aztec times, athletic contests at the ball court had apparently lost some of their religious significance. Gambling was increasingly common, and wagering on the results of the matches was widespread. One province reportedly sent 16,000 rubber balls to the capital city of Tenochtitlan as its annual tribute to the royal court. Aztec religion contained a distinct element of fatalism that was inherent in the creation myth, which described an unceasing struggle between the forces of good and evil throughout the universe. This struggle led to the creation and destruction of 4 worlds, or suns. The world was now living in the time of the 5th sun. But that world, too, was destined to end with the destruction of this earth and all that is within it. Even jade is shattered, even gold is crushed, even quetzal plumes are torn. One does not live forever on this earth, we endure only for an instant. In an effort to postpone the day of reckoning, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice. The Aztecs believed that by appeasing the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, with sacrifices, they could delay the final destruction of their world. Victims were prepared for the ceremony through elaborate rituals and then brought to the holy shrine, where their hearts were ripped out of their chests and presented to the gods as a holy offering. It was an honor to be chosen for sacrifice, and captives were often used as sacrificial victims, since they represented valor, the trait the Aztecs prized most. Art and culture. Like the art of the Olmecs, most Aztec architecture, art, and sculpture had religious significance. At the center of the capital city of Tenochtitlan was the sacred precinct, dominated by the massive pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and the rain god, Tlaloc. According to Bernaldez, at its base the pyramid was equal to the plots of 6 large European townhouses and tapered from there to the top, which was surmounted by a platform containing shrines to the gods and an altar for performing human sacrifices. The entire pyramid was covered with brightly colored paintings and sculptures. Although little Aztec painting survives, it was evidently of high quality. Daz compared the best work with that of Michelangelo. Artisans worked with stone and with soft metals such as gold and silver, which they cast using the lost wax technique. They did not have the knowledge for making implements in bronze or iron, however. Stoneworking consisted primarily of representations of the gods and bas-reliefs depicting religious ceremonies. Among the most famous is the massive disc called the Stone of the 5th Sun, carved for use at the central pyramid at Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs had devised a form of writing based on hieroglyphs that represented an object or a concept. The symbols had no phonetic significance and did not constitute a writing system as such but could give the sense of a message and were probably used by civilian or religious officials as notes or memorandums for their orations. Although many of the notes simply recorded dates in the complex calendar that had evolved since Olmec times, others provide insight into the daily lives of the Aztec peoples. A trained class of scribes carefully painted the notes on paper made from the inner bark of fig trees. Unfortunately, many of these notes were destroyed by the Spaniards as part of their effort to eradicate all aspects of Aztec religion and culture. The first civilizations in South America. Focus question: what role did the environment play in the evolution of societies in the Americas? South America is a vast continent, characterized by extremes in climate and geography. The north is dominated by the mighty Amazon River, which flows through dense tropical rainforests carrying a larger flow of water than any other river system in the world. Farther to the south, the forests are replaced by prairies and steppes stretching westward to the Andes Mountains, which extend the entire length of the continent, from the Isthmus of Panama to the Strait of Magellan. Along the Pacific coast, on the western slopes of the mountains, are some of the driest desert regions in the world. South America has been inhabited by human beings for more than 12,000 years. Wall paintings discovered at the so-called Cavern of the Painted Rock in the Amazon region suggest that Stone Age peoples were living in the area at least 11,000 years ago, and a site at Monte Verde, along the central coast of Chile, has been dated to 10,500 BCE. Early peoples lived by hunting, fishing, and food gathering, but there are indications that irrigated farming was being practiced on the western slopes of the Andes Mountains more than 5,000 years ago. Carol. By the 3rd millennium BCE, complex societies had begun to emerge in the coastal regions of modern-day Peru and Ecuador. Some settlements were located along the coast, but the remnants of farming communities watered by canals have also been found in the valleys of rivers flowing down from the Andes Mountains. Fish, reeds, and various other maritime products were traded to inland peoples for agricultural produce, wool, and salt. The most vivid example of this process can be seen along the Pacific coast of modern-day Peru. By 3500 BCE, more than 1,000 years earlier than the earliest known cities in Mesoamerica, the first urban settlements appeared in the region. At Carol, a highly publicized site located 14 miles inland from the coast, the remnants of a 4,500-year-old city sit on the crest of a 60-foot-high plateau just above the fertile valley of the Sup River. Several pyramids similar to those built in Mesoamerica were erected at the site, along with plazas, sunken altars, residential areas, and structures that were evidently used for astronomical observation. Nearly 20 similar settlements are scattered over an area of 66 hectares on both sides of the Sup River as it makes its way westward to the sea. The inhabitants of these ancient settlements raised squash, beans, and tomatoes in the river valley below, and provided such agricultural produce, as well as cotton and salt, to fishing communities along the nearby coast, where the cotton material was used to make fish nets. In return, they received maritime products and reeds for baskets. They were sophisticated farmers, as evidenced by the remnants of ancient irrigation canals found in the vicinity. Some maritime trade was apparently conducted along the Pacific coast, as evidenced by the presence of spawnless shells from Ecuador, used for religious ceremonies, and various plants not found in the vicinity. The exact nature of these early communities is not yet clear. Indeed, it is not known whether these early settlements were actual villages or merely ceremonial centers, although there is convincing evidence of the existence of distinct social classes, a ruling elite, specialized labor, and organized religious beliefs, as well as cultural activities such as music and crafts. There are even indications of the appearance of a primitive writing system. Although the reasons for eventual decline are not yet clear, this culture apparently reached its height during the 1st millennium BCE with the emergence of the Chavan style, named for a site near the modern city of Chavandahuantar. The ceremonial precinct at the site contained an impressive stone temple complete with interior galleries, a stone block ceiling, and a system of underground canals that probably channeled water into the temple complex for ceremonial purposes. The structure was surrounded by stone figures depicting various deities and 2 pyramids. Evidence of metallurgy has also been found, with objects made of copper and gold. Another impressive technological achievement was the building in 300 BCE of the first solar observatory in the Americas in the form of 13 stone towers on a hillside north of Lima, Peru. Mush. Chavan society had broken down by 200 BCE, but early in the 1st millennium CE, another advanced civilization appeared in northern Peru, in the valley of the Mush River, which flows from the foothills of the Andes into the Pacific Ocean. It occupied an area of more than 2,500 square miles, and its capital city, large enough to contain more than 10,000 people, was dominated by 2 massive adobe pyramids nearly 100 feet high. The larger one, known today as the Pyramid of the Sun, covered a total of 15 acres. The other, built on the side of a mountain and known as the Pyramid of the Moon, was adorned with painted murals depicting battles, ritual sacrifices, and various local deities. Artifacts found at Mush, especially the metalwork and stone and ceramic figures, exhibit a high quality of artisanship. They were imitated at river valley sites throughout the surrounding area, which suggests that the influence of the Mush rulers may have extended as far as 400 miles along the coast. The artifacts also indicate that the people at Mush, like those in Central America, were preoccupied with warfare. Paintings and pottery as well as other artifacts in stone, metal, and ceramics frequently portray warriors, prisoners, and sacrificial victims. The Mush were also fascinated by the heavens, and much of their art consisted of celestial symbols and astronomical constellations. Environmental problems. The Mush River Valley is extremely arid, normally receiving less than an inch of rain annually. The peoples in the area compensated by building a sophisticated irrigation system to carry water from the river to the parched fields. At its zenith, Mush culture was spectacular. By the 8th century CE, however, the civilization was in a state of collapse. The irrigation canals had been abandoned, and the remaining population had left the area and moved farther inland or suffered from severe malnutrition. What had happened to bring Mush culture to this untimely end? Archaeologists speculate that environmental disruptions, perhaps brought on by changes in the temperature of the Pacific Ocean known as El Niño, led to alternating periods of drought and flooding of coastal regions, which caused the irrigated fields to silt up. The warm water created by El Niño conditions also killed local marine life, severely damaging the local fishing industry. Wari and Chima. A few hundred miles to the south of Mush, a people known as the Wari culture began to expand from their former home in the Andes foothills and established communities along the coast in the vicinity of modern Lima, Peru. As the state of Mush declined, the Wari gradually spread northward in the 8th century and began to occupy many of the urban sites in the Mush Valley. According to some scholars, they may even have made use of the Mush's sacred buildings and appropriated their religious symbolism. In the process, the Wari created the most extensive land empire yet seen in South America. In the end, however, they too succumbed to the challenge posed by unstable environmental conditions. Around 1100, a new power, the Kingdom of Chima, with its capital at Chanchan, at the mouth of the Mush River, emerged in the area. Built almost entirely of adobe, Chanchan housed an estimated 30,000 residents in an area of more than 12 square miles that included a number of palace compounds surrounded by walls nearly 30 feet high. One compound contained an intricate labyrinth that wound its way progressively inward until it ended in a central chamber, probably occupied by the ruler. Like the Mush before them, the people of Chima relied on irrigation to funnel the water from the river into their fields. An elaborate system of canals brought the water through hundreds of miles of hilly terrain to the fields near the coast. Nevertheless, by the 15th century, Chima, too, had disappeared, a victim of floods and a series of earthquakes that destroyed the intricate irrigation system that had been the basis of its survival. These early civilizations in the Andes were by no means isolated from other societies in the region. As early as 2000 BCE, local peoples had been venturing into the Pacific Ocean on wind-powered rafts constructed of balsa wood. By the late 1st millennium CE, seafarers from the coast of Ecuador had established a vast trading network that extended southward to central Peru and as far north as western Mexico, more than 2,000 miles away. Items transported included jewelry, beads, and metal goods. In all likelihood, technological exchanges were an important byproduct of the relationship. Transportation by land, however, was more difficult. Although roads were constructed to facilitate communication between communities, the forbidding terrain in the mountains was a serious obstacle, and the only draft animal on the entire continent was the llama, which is considerably less hardy than the cattle, horses, and water buffalo used in much of Asia. Such problems undoubtedly hampered the development of regular contacts with distant societies in the Americas, as well as the exchange of goods and ideas that had lubricated their rise of civilizations from China to the Mediterranean Sea. The Inca. The Chimú kingdom was eventually succeeded in the late 15th century by an invading force from the mountains far to the south. In the late 14th century, the Inca were a small community in the area of Cusco, a city located at an altitude of 10,000 feet in the mountains of southern Peru. In the 1440s, however, under the leadership of their powerful ruler Pachacuti, sometimes called Pachacutec, or he who transforms the world, the Inca launched a campaign of conquest that eventually brought the entire region under their authority. Under Pachacuti and his immediate successors, Tupa Inca and Huayna Inca, the word Inca means ruler. The boundaries of the empire were extended as far as Ecuador, central Chile, and the edge of the Amazon basin. The Four Quarters, Inca politics and society. Pachacuti created a highly centralized state. With a stunning concern for mathematical precision, he divided his empire, called Tawantinsuyu, or the world of the Four Quarters, into provinces and districts. Each province contained about 10,000 residents, at least in theory, and was ruled by a governor related to the royal family. Excess inhabitants were transferred to other locations. The capital of Cusco was divided into 4 quarters, or residential areas, and the social status and economic functions of the residents of each quarter were rigidly defined. The state was built on forced labor. Often entire communities of workers were moved from one part of the country to another to open virgin lands or engage in massive construction projects. Under Pachacuti, Cusco was transformed from a city of mud and thatch into an imposing metropolis of stone. The walls, built of close-fitting stones without the use of mortar, were a wonder to early European visitors. The most impressive structure in the city was a temple dedicated to the sun. According to a Spanish observer, all 4 walls of the temple were covered from top to bottom with plates and slabs of gold. Equally impressive are the ruins of the abandoned city of Machu Picchu, built on a lofty hilltop far above the Urubamba River. Another major construction project was a system of 24,800 miles of highways and roads that extended from the border of modern Colombia to a point south of modern Santiago, Chile. 2 major roadways extended in a north-south direction, one through the Andes Mountains and the other along the coast, with connecting routes between them. Rest houses and storage depots were placed along the roads. Suspension bridges made of braided fiber and fastened to stone abutments on opposite banks were built over ravines and waterways. Use of the highways was restricted to official and military purposes. Train runners carried messages rapidly from one way station to another, enabling information to travel up to 140 miles in a single day. In rural areas, the population lived mainly by farming. In the mountains, the most common form was terraced agriculture, watered by irrigation systems that carried precise amounts of water into the fields, which were planted with maize, potatoes, and other crops. The plots were tilled by collective labor regulated by the state. Like other aspects of Incan society, marriage was strictly regulated, and men and women were required to select a marriage partner from within the immediate tribal group. For women, there was one escape from a life of domestic servitude. Fortunate maidens were selected to serve as chosen virgins in temples throughout the country. Noblewomen were eligible to compete for service in the Temple of the Sun at Cusco, while commoners might hope to serve in temples in the provincial capitals. Punishment for breaking the vow of chastity was harsh, and few evidently took the risk. Inca culture. Like many other civilizations in pre-Columbian Latin America, the Inca state was built on war. Soldiers for the 200,000-man Inca army, the largest and best armed in the region, were raised by universal male conscription. Military units were moved rapidly along the highway system and were bivouacked in the rest houses located along the roadside. Because the Inca had no wheeled vehicles, supplies were carried on the backs of llamas. Once an area was placed under Inca authority, the local inhabitants were instructed in the Quechua language, which became the lingua franca of the state, and were introduced to the state religion. The Inca had no writing system but kept records using a system of knotted strings called quipu, maintained by professionally trained officials, that were able to record all data of a numerical nature. What could not be recorded in such a manner was committed to memory and then recited when needed. The practice was apparently not invented by the Inca. Fragments of quipu have been found at Carol and dated at approximately 5,000 years ago. Nor apparently was the experiment limited to the Americas. A passage in the Chinese classic The Way of the Tao declares, "Let the people revert to communication by knotted cords." As in the case of the Aztecs and the Maya, the lack of a fully developed writing system did not prevent the Inca from realizing a high level of cultural achievement. Most of what survives was recorded by the Spanish and consists of entertainment for the elites. The Inca had a highly developed tradition of court theater, including both tragic and comic works. There was also some poetry, composed in blank verse and often accompanied by music played on reed instruments. Stateless societies in the Americas. Focus question: what were the main characteristics of stateless societies in the Americas, and how did they resemble and differ from the civilizations that rose there? Beyond Central America and the high ridges of the Andes Mountains, on the Great Plains of North America, along the Amazon River in South America, and on the islands of the Caribbean Sea, other communities of Amerindians were also beginning to master the art of agriculture and to build organized societies. Although human beings had occupied much of the continent of North America during the early phase of human settlement, the switch to farming as a means of survival did not occur until the 3rd millennium BCE at the earliest, and much later in most areas of the continent. Until that time, most Amerindian communities lived by hunting, fishing, or foraging. As the supply of large animals began to diminish, they turned to smaller game and to fishing and foraging for wild plants, fruits, and nuts. The eastern woodlands. It was probably during the 3rd millennium BCE that peoples in the eastern woodlands, the land in eastern North America from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, began to cultivate indigenous plants for food in a systematic way. As wild game and food became scarce, some communities began to place more emphasis on cultivating crops. This shift first occurred in the Mississippi River Valley from Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois down to the Gulf of Mexico. Among the most commonly cultivated crops were maize, squash, beans, and various grasses. As the population in the area increased, people began to congregate in villages, and sedentary communities began to develop in the alluvial lowlands, where the soil could be cultivated for many years at a time because of the nutrients deposited by the river water. Village councils were established to adjudicate disputes, and in a few cases, several villages banded together under the authority of a local chieftain. Urban centers began to appear, some of them inhabited by 10,000 people or more. At the same time, regional trade increased. The people of the Hopal culture in Ohio ranged from the shores of Lake Superior to the Appalachian Mountains and the Gulf of Mexico in search of metals, shells, obsidian, and manufactured items to support their economic needs and religious beliefs. Cahokia. At the site of Cahokia, near the modern city of East St. Louis, Illinois, archaeologists found a burial mound more than 98 feet high with a base larger than that of the Great Pyramid in Egypt. 100 smaller mounds were also found in the vicinity. The town itself, which covered almost 300 acres and was surrounded by a wooden stockade, was apparently the administrative capital of much of the surrounding territory until its decline in the 1200s. With a population of more than 20,000, It was reportedly the largest city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed that number in the early 19th century. Cahokia carried on extensive trade with other communities throughout the region, and there are some signs of regular contacts with the civilizations in Mesoamerica, such as the presence of ball courts in the Central American style. But wars were not uncommon, leading the Iroquois, who inhabited much of the modern states of Pennsylvania and New York as well as parts of southern Canada, to create a tribal alliance called the League of Iroquois. The ancient Pueblo peoples. West of the Mississippi River Basin, most Amerindian peoples lived by hunting or food gathering. During the first millennium CE, knowledge of agriculture gradually spread up the rivers to the Great Plains, and farming was practiced as far west as southwestern Colorado, where an agricultural community was established in an area extending from northern New Mexico and Arizona to southwestern Colorado and parts of southern Utah. Although they apparently never discovered the wheel or used beasts of burden, these ancient Pueblo peoples, formerly known by the Navajo name Nisarsi, or Alien Ancient Ones, created a system of roads that facilitated an extensive exchange of technology, products, and ideas throughout the region. By the 9th century, they had mastered the art of irrigation, which allowed them to expand their productive efforts to squash and beans, and had established an important urban center at Chaco Canyon, in southern New Mexico, where they built a walled city with dozens of three-story adobe communal houses, today called pueblos, with timbered roofs. Community religious functions were carried out in two large circular chambers called kivas. Clothing was made from hides or cotton cloth. At its height, Pueblo Bonito contained several hundred compounds housing several thousand residents. In the mid-12th century, the ancient Pueblo peoples moved north to Mesa Verde, in southwestern Colorado. At first, they settled on top of the mesa, but eventually they expanded onto the cliffs of surrounding canyons. Sometime during the late 13th century, however, Mesa Verde was also abandoned, and the inhabitants migrated southward. Their descendants, the Zuni and the Hopi, now occupy pueblos in central Arizona and New Mexico, thus leading them to adopt their new name. For years, archaeologists surmised that a severe drought was the cause of the migration, but new evidence has raised doubts that decreasing rainfall, by itself, was a sufficient explanation. An increase in internecine warfare, perhaps brought about by climatic changes, may also have played a role in the decision to relocate. Some archaeologists point to evidence that cannibalism was practiced at Pueblo Bonito and suggest that migrants from the south may have arrived in the area, provoking bitter rivalries within ancient Pueblo society. In any event, with increasing aridity and the importation of the horse by the Spanish in the 16th century, hunting revived, and mounted nomads like the Apache and the Navajo came to dominate much of the Southwest. Prior to their relocation, however, the Pueblo Bonito peoples maintained commercial contacts with their counterparts in Mexico and even as far south as the Pacific coast of South America. South America, the Arawak. East of the Andes Mountains in South America, other Amerindian societies were beginning to make the transition to agriculture. Perhaps the most prominent were the Arawak, a people living along the Orinoco River in modern Venezuela. Having begun to cultivate manioc, a tuber also known as cassava or yuca, the source of tapioca, along the banks of the river, they gradually migrated down to the coast and then proceeded to move eastward along the northern coast of the continent. Some occupied the islands of the Caribbean Sea. In their new island habitat, they lived by a mixture of fishing, hunting, and cultivating maize, beans, manioc, and squash, as well as other crops such as peanuts, peppers, and pineapples. As the population increased, a pattern of political organization above the village level appeared, along with recognizable social classes headed by a chieftain, cacique, whose authority included control over the economy. The Arawak practiced human sacrifice, and some urban centers contained pole courts, suggesting the possibility of contacts with Mesoamerica. Eventually, new peoples from South America began to migrate into the islands of the Caribbean Sea. Known as Caribs, they tended to be more warlike than their predecessors and often drove the previous arrivals to seek refuge on islands farther to the north. A Carib community survives today on the island of Dominica, in the Lesser Antilles. In most such societies, where clear-cut class stratifications had not as yet taken place, men and women were considered of equal status. Men were responsible for hunting, warfare, and dealing with outsiders, while women were accountable for the crops, the distribution of food, maintaining the household, and bearing and raising the children. Their roles were complementary and were often viewed as a divine division of labor. In such cases, women in the stateless societies of North America held positions of greater respect than their counterparts in the river valley civilizations of the ancient world. Amazonia. Substantial human activity was also apparently taking place in the Amazon River Valley. Scholars have been skeptical that advanced societies could take shape in the region because the soil was believed to lack adequate nutrients to support a large population. Recent archaeological evidence, however, suggests that in some areas where decaying organic matter produces a rich soil suitable for farming, such as the region near the modern river port of Santa Maria, large agricultural societies may once have existed. More information about this previously unknown culture must await further archaeological evidence. Chronology. Early Mesoamerica. Arrival of human beings in America. At least 15,000 years ago. Agriculture first practiced. c. 8000 BCE. Rise of Olmec culture. 1200 BCE. End of Olmec era 4th century. BCE. Origins of Mayan civilization. First millennium CE. Teotihuacan civilization. c. 300 BCE to 800 CE. Classical era of Mayan culture. 300 to 900 CE. Title abandoned. 870 CE. Migration of Mexico to Valley of Mexico. Late 1100s. Kingdom of the Aztecs. 1300s to 1400s. Chronology. Early South America. Monteverde. 10,500 BCE. First organized societies in the Andes. c. 3,500 BCE. Agriculture first widely practiced. c. 3,200 BCE. Founding of Carroll. c. 2,500 BCE. Chavin style. First millennium BCE. Mush civilization. c. 150 to 800 CE. Wari culture. c. 500 to 1000 CE. Civilization of Chima. c. 1100 to 1450. Inca takeover in Central Andes. 1400s. Comparative illustration. Religion and philosophy. The pyramid. The building of monumental structures known as pyramids was characteristic of a number of civilizations that arose in antiquity. The pyramid symbolized the link between the world of human beings and the realm of deities and was often used to house the tomb of a deceased ruler. Shown here are two prominent examples. The upper photo shows the pyramids of Giza, Egypt, built in the 3rd millennium BCE, and located near the modern city of Cairo. The second photo shows the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, erected in central Mexico in the 5th century CE. Similar structures of various sizes were built throughout the Western Hemisphere. The concept of the pyramid was also widely applied in parts of Asia. Scholars still debate the technical aspects of constructing such pyramids. How do the pyramids erected in the Western Hemisphere compare with similar structures in other parts of the world? What were their symbolic meanings to the builders? The creation of the world, a Mayan view. Religion and philosophy. Popul Vuh, a sacred work of the ancient Maya, is an account of Mayan history and religious beliefs. No written version in the original Mayan script is extant, but shortly after the Spanish conquest, it was written down in Quiche, the spoken language of the Maya, using the Latin script, apparently from memory. This version was later translated into Spanish. The following excerpt from the opening lines of Popul Vuh recounts the Mayan myth of the creation. Popul Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya. This is the account of how all was in suspense, all calm, in silence, all motionless, still, and the expanse of the sky was empty. This is the first account, the first narrative. There was neither man, nor animal, birds, fishes, crabs, trees, stones, caves, ravines, grasses, nor forests. There was only the sky. The surface of the earth had not appeared. There was only the calm sea and the great expanse of the sky. There was nothing brought together, nothing which could make a noise, nor anything which might move, or tremble, or could make noise in the sky. There was nothing standing, only the calm water, the placid sea, alone and tranquil. Nothing existed. There was only immobility and silence in the darkness, in the night. Only the Creator, the Maker, Tepe, Guqmats, the forefathers, were in the water surrounded with light. They were hidden under green and blue feathers, and were therefore called Guqmats. By nature they were great sages and great thinkers. In this manner the sky existed and also the heart of heaven, which is the name of God, and thus he is called. Then came the word. Tepe and Guqmats came together in the darkness, in the night, and Tepe and Guqmats talked together. They talked then, discussing and deliberating, they agreed, they united their words and their thoughts. Then while they meditated, it became clear to them that when dawn would break, man must appear. Then they planned the creation, and the growth of the trees and the thickets and the birth of life and the creation of man. Thus it was arranged in the darkness and in the night by the heart of heaven, who is called Hurricane. The first is called Kakalha Hurricane. The second is Chippy Kakalha. The third is Raksa Kakalha. And these three are the heart of heaven. So it was that they made perfect the work, when they did it after thinking and meditating upon it. What similarities and differences do you see between this account of the beginning of the world and those of other ancient civilizations? A sample of Mayan writing. Art and ideas. The Maya were the only Mesoamerican people to devise a complete written language. Although the origins of the Mayan writing system are unknown, many specialists believe that it may have emerged from scripts invented earlier by the neighboring Zapotecas or Olmecs, and that the Maya learned of these experiments through contacts with these peoples in the first millennium BCE. Like the Sumerian and Egyptian scripts, the Mayan system was composed of a mixture of ideographs and phonetic symbols, which were written in double columns to be read from left to right and top to bottom. The language was rudimentary in many ways. It had few adjectives or adverbs, and the numbering system used only 3 symbols, a shell for 0, a dot for 1, and a bar for 5. During the classical era from 300 to 900 CE, the Maya used the script to record dynastic statistics with deliberate precision, listing the date of the ruler's birth, his accession to power, and his marriage and death, while highlighting victories in battle, the capture of prisoners, and ritual ceremonies. The symbols were carved on stone panels, stelae, and funerary urns, or were painted with a brush on folding screen books made of bark paper. Only 4 of these books from the late period remain extant today. A sample of Mayan hieroglyphs is shown below. How do Mayan glyphs compare with the early forms of writing in Egypt, China, and Mesopotamia? Consider purpose, ease of writing, and potential for development into a purely phonetic system. Markets and merchandise in Aztec Mexico. Interaction and exchange. One of our most valuable descriptions of Aztec civilization is The Conquest of New Spain, written by Bernal Diaz, a Spaniard who visited Mexico in 1519. In the following passage, Diaz describes the great market at Tenochtitlan. Bernal Diaz, The Conquest of New Spain. Let us begin with the dealers in gold, silver, and precious stones, feathers, cloaks, and embroidered goods, and male and female slaves who are also sold there. They bring as many slaves to be sold in that market as the Portuguese bring Negroes from Guinea. Some are brought there attached to long poles by means of collars round their necks to prevent them from escaping, but others are left loose. Next there were those who sold coarser cloth, and cotton goods and fabrics made of twisted thread, and there were chocolate merchants with their chocolate. In this way you could see every kind of merchandise to be found anywhere in New Spain, laid out in the same way as goods are laid out in my own district of Medina del Campo, a center for fairs, where each line of stalls has its own particular sort. So it was in this great market. There were those who sold sisal cloth and ropes and the sandals they wear on their feet, which are made from the same plant. All these were kept in one part of the market, in the place assigned to them, and in another part were skins of tigers and lions, otters, jackals, and deer, badgers, mountain cats, and other wild animals, some tanned and some untanned, and other classes of merchandise. There were sellers of kidney beans and sage and other vegetables and herbs in another place, and in yet another they were selling fowls, and birds with great dewlaps, also rabbits, hares, deer, young ducks, little dogs, and other such creatures. Then there were the fruiterers, and the women who sold cooked food, flour and honey cake, and tripe, had their part of the market. Then came pottery of all kinds, from big water jars to little jugs, displayed in its own place, also honey, honey paste, and other sweets like nugget. Elsewhere they sold timber too, boards, cradles, beams, blocks, and benches, all in a quarter of their own. Then there were the sellers of pitch pine for torches, and other things of that kind, and I must also mention, with all apologies, that they sold many canoe loads of human excrement, which they kept in the creeks near the market. This was for the manufacture of salt and the curing of skins, which they say cannot be done without it. I know that many gentlemen will laugh at this, but I assure them it is true. I may add that on all the roads they have shelters made of reeds or straw or grass so that they can retire when they wish to do so, and purge their bowels unseen by passers-by, and also in order that their excrement shall not be lost. Which of the items offered for sale in this account might also have been available in a market in Asia, Egypt, or Europe? What types of goods mentioned here appear to be unique to the Americas? Aztec religion through Spanish eyes. Religion and philosophy. When the first European explorers arrived in Mexico in the early 16th century, they reported their impressions of Aztec society in diaries and letters to their compatriots back home. The following passage from Father Diego Duran's The Aztecs, The History of the Indies of New Spain describes the ritual of human sacrifice as a central part of Aztec religion. The Aztecs believed that only the gift of human hearts would appease their god Huitzilopochtli and prevent him from bringing disaster to their civilization. Although some modern-day scholars doubt the accuracy of such reports, it is now widely accepted that human sacrifice was a common practice in many Amerindian societies, as it had once been in other parts of the world as well. Diego Duran, The Aztecs, The History of the Indies of New Spain. When the day of the feast arrived, Moctezuma and Tlacael blackened their bodies with soot and applied it in such a way that it caught the light. They placed crowns of fine feathers, adorned with gold and precious stones, upon their heads, and on each arm they wore a sheath of gold reaching from the elbow to the shoulder. On their feet were richly worked jaguar skin sandals, inlaid with gold and gems. They also were robed in splendid royal mantles. Jeweled plugs were attached to holes in their noses, and both these lords carried flint knives in their hands. The king and Tlacael now appeared before the assembly and went to stand upon the stone which was the likeness and image of the sun, one having ascended by one staircase and the other by another. The 5 priests of sacrifice followed them. They were to hold down the feet, hands and heads of the victims, and they were painted all over with red ochre, even their loincloths and tunics. Upon their heads they wore paper crowns surmounted by little shields which hung to the middle of their foreheads, also painted in ochre. On the top of their heads they wore long stiff feathers which had been tied to their hair and which stood straight up. On their feet were very common, worthless sandals. The 5 priests entered and claimed the prisoner who stood first in the line at the skull rack. Each prisoner they took to the place where the king stood, and, when they had forced him to stand upon the stone which was the figure and likeness of the sun, they threw him upon his back. One took him by the right arm, another by the left, one by his left foot, another by his right, while the 5th priest tied his neck with a cord and held him down so that he could not move. The king lifted the knife on high and made a gash in his breast. Having opened it, he extracted the heart and raised it high with his hand as an offering to the sun. When the heart had cooled, he tossed it into the circular depression, taking some of the blood in his hand and sprinkling it in the direction of the sun. In this way the sacrificers killed 4, one by one, then Tlikel came and killed another 4 in his turn. And so, 4 by 4, the prisoners were slain, till every last man that had been brought from the mixed co had perished. What other societies encountered in this book engaged in human sacrifices as an aspect of their religious practices? Comparative illustration. Interaction and exchange. Aspero and Carroll. Archaeologists today debate whether maritime or river valley communities were the most prevalent antecedents of modern urban centers of civilization. Along the Pacific coast of South America in what today is the state of Peru, the answer apparently was both. On a desolate plateau just adjacent to the fertile banks of the Sup River, the ceremonial center of Carroll, right, began to emerge at least 5,000 years ago. A few miles to the west, peoples living along the coast established their own settlement, known as Aspero, left, based on the fruits of the sea. For centuries, the two settlements survived in a symbiotic relationship, providing each other with foodstuffs and articles of daily use necessary for their survival. Together they composed one of the oldest centers of civilization in South America, if not in the world at large. What specific kinds of goods were exchanged between these two communities during their heyday? Can you think of other civilizations where a similar relationship existed? Comparative essay. History and the environment. Earth and environment. In The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1788, the British historian Edward Gibbon raised a question that has fascinated historians ever since. What brought about the collapse of that once powerful civilization that dominated the Mediterranean region for more than 5 centuries? Traditional explanations have centered on political or cultural factors, such as imperial overreach, moral decay, military weakness, or the impact of invasions. Recently, however, some historians have suggested that environmental problems, such as poisoning due to the use of lead water pipes and cups, the spread of malaria, or a lengthy drought in wheat-growing regions in North Africa, might have at least contributed to Rome's collapse. The current interest in the impact of the environment on the Roman Empire reflects a growing awareness among historians that environmental conditions may have been a key factor in the fate of several of the great societies in the ancient world. Climatic changes or natural disasters almost certainly led to the decline and collapse of Harappan civilization in the Indus River Valley. In the Americas, massive flooding brought about by the El Niño effect, environmental conditions triggered by changes in water temperature in the Pacific Ocean, appears to be one possible cause for the collapse of the Mush civilization in what is today Peru, while drought and overcultivation of the land are often cited as reasons for the decline of the Maya in Mesoamerica. Climatic changes continued to affect the fate of nations and peoples in later eras as well. Drought conditions and overuse of the land may have led to the gradual decline of Mesopotamia as a focal point of advanced civilization in the Middle East, while soil erosion and colder conditions doomed an early attempt by the Vikings to establish a foothold in Greenland and North America. Sometimes the problems were self-inflicted, as on Easter Island, a remote outpost in the Pacific Ocean, where Polynesian settlers migrating from the west about 900 CE may have denuded the landscape that by the 15th century, what had been a reasonably stable and peaceful society had descended into civil war and cannibalism. Climatic changes, of course, have not always been detrimental to the health and prosperity of human beings. A warming trend that took place at the end of the last ice age eventually made much of the world more habitable for farming peoples about 10,000 years ago. The effects of El Niño may be beneficial to people living in some areas and disastrous in others. But human misuse of land and water resources is always dangerous to settled societies, especially those living in fragile environments. Many ancient civilizations throughout the world were weakened or destroyed by changes taking place in the environment. What are some examples in the pre-Columbian Americas? Virgins with red cheeks. Family and society. A letter from a Peruvian chief to King Philip III of Spain written 400 years ago gives us a first-hand account of the nature of traditional Incan society. The purpose of author Juan Palma was both to justify the history and culture of the Inca peoples and to record their sufferings under Spanish domination. In his letter, Palma describes Incan daily life from birth to death in minute detail. He explains the different tasks assigned to men and women, beginning with their early education. Whereas boys were taught to watch the flocks and trap animals, girls were taught to dye, spin, and weave cloth and perform other domestic chores. Most interesting, perhaps, was the emphasis that the Inca placed on virginity, as is evident in the document presented here. The Inca's tradition of temple virgins is reminiscent of similar practices in ancient Rome, where young girls from noble families were chosen as priestesses to tend the sacred fire in the temple of Vesta for 30 years. If an Incan temple virgin lost her virginity, she was condemned to be buried alive in an underground chamber. Juan Palma, Letter to a King. During the time of the Incas, certain women, who were called Akla or the Chosen, were destined for lifelong virginity. Mostly they were confined in houses and they belonged to one of two main categories, namely sacred virgins and common virgins. The so-called virgins with red cheeks entered upon their duties at the age of 20 and were dedicated to the service of the sun, the moon, and the day star. In their whole life they were never allowed to speak to a man. The virgins of the Incas' own shrine of Huanacori were known for their beauty as well as their chastity. The other principal shrines had similar girls in attendance. At the less important shrines there were the older virgins who occupied themselves with spinning and weaving the silk-like clothes worn by their idols. There was a still lower class of virgins, over 40 years of age and no longer very beautiful, who performed unimportant religious duties and worked in the fields or as ordinary seamstresses. Daughters of noble families who had grown into old maids were adept at making girdles, headbands, string bags, and similar articles in the intervals of their pious observances. Girls who had musical talent were selected to sing or play the flute and drum at court, weddings and other ceremonies, and all the innumerable festivals of the Inca year. There was yet another class of Akla or Chosen, only some of whom kept their virginity and others not. These were the Inca's beautiful attendants and concubines, who were drawn from noble families and lived in his palaces. They made clothing for him out of material finer than taffeta or silk. They also prepared a maize spirit of extraordinary richness, which was matured for an entire month, and they cooked delicious dishes for the Inca. They also lay with him, but never with any other man. According to this selection, one of the chief duties of a woman in Incan society was to spin and weave. In what other traditional societies was textile making a woman's work? Why do you think this was the case? Chapter Summary. The first human beings did not arrive in the Americas until quite late in the prehistorical period. For the next several millennia, their descendants were forced to respond to the challenges of the environment in total isolation from other parts of the world. Nevertheless, around 5000 BCE, farming settlements began to appear in river valleys and upland areas in both Central and South America. Not long afterward, as measured in historical time, organized communities embarked on the long march toward creating advanced technological societies. Although the total number of people living in the Americas is a matter of debate, estimates range from 10 million to as many as 90 million people. What is perhaps most striking about the developments in the Western Hemisphere is how closely they parallel those of other civilizations. Irrigated agriculture, long-distance trade, urbanization, and the development of a writing system were all hallmarks of the emergence of advanced societies of the classical type. Some of the parallels, of course, were less appealing. States in the Western Hemisphere were every bit as addicted to warfare as their counterparts elsewhere. The widespread use of human sacrifice is reminiscent of similar practices in other ancient societies. Not much is yet known about relations between men and women in the Americas, but it appears that gender roles were as sharply delineated there as in much of Asia and the Mediterranean world. In some respects, the societies that emerged in the Americas were not as advanced technologically as their counterparts elsewhere. They were not familiar with the process of smelting iron, for example, and they had not yet invented wheeled vehicles. Their writing systems were still in their infancy. Several possible reasons have been advanced to explain this technological gap. Geographic isolation not only from people of other continents but also, in some cases, from each other deprived them of the diffusion of ideas that had enabled other societies to learn from their neighbors. Contacts among societies in the Americas were made much more difficult because of the topography and the diversity of the environment. In some ways, too, they were not as blessed by nature. As the sociologist Jared Diamond has pointed out, the Americas did not possess many indigenous varieties of edible grasses that could encourage hunter-gatherers to take up farming. Nor were there abundant large mammals that could easily be domesticated for food and transport. Horses had disappeared from the Western Hemisphere before the arrival of Homo sapiens sapiens at the end of the last ice age. It was not until the arrival of the Europeans that such familiar attributes of civilization became widely available for human use in the Americas. These disadvantages can help explain some of the problems that the early peoples of the Americas encountered in their efforts to master their environments. It is interesting to note that the spread of agriculture and increasing urbanization had already begun to produce a rising incidence of infectious diseases. It is also significant that in the Americas, as elsewhere, many of the first civilizations formed by the human species appear to have been brought to an end as much by environmental changes and disease as by war. In the next chapter, we shall return to Asia, where new civilizations were in the process of replacing the ancient empires.